All right, well, good evening, everyone. It's after 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get going and let your remaining colleagues join us as they will. Welcome to, I guess we're week number 2 now officially with our Zoom sessions. And so hope everyone is having a good week. And I'll do a couple of housekeeping items first, and then we'll get into our material for the evening, which is primarily to wrap up our discussion of the constitutional background and foundations of American federalism and intergovernmental relations. So first off, thank you for your Beach Board essay number 1. I've gone through and read those on your expectations coming into this course. I provided grades. I didn't provide feedback though, because again, you're giving me your expectations, so there really aren't right or wrong answers. So not really much of a need for feedback on this first Beach Board assignment. But I did provide those grades, and so every essay that's been turned in has been graded and should have been returned to you. So we're in good shape there. For this week, this coming week, we have Beach Board number 2. And in Beach Board number 2, you are going to select an issue that has some relevance to intergovernmental relations, which really that runs the gamut of policies and issues. It's almost difficult to find a policy or an issue that does not have some intergovernmental components to them. But you'll be selecting a policy or an issue that's intergovernmental in nature, where you have more than one level of government involved in that policy or that issue, whether it be passing the policy or implementing the policy or evaluating it. There's some role for more than one level of government to play. Based upon that issue, what you'll then do is you'll talk to me a bit about the roles played by the different levels of government on that issue. Ideally, it would be great if you have national, state, and local governments all involved in this issue. But if it's an issue that you're really interested in and it only involves national and state or state and local, that's okay as well. But just describe to me what some of the roles of the different levels of government are in this issue. Talk about the balance of power between the different governments for this issue, and then how that balance of power has changed over time. Has it changed? And if so, how has it changed? Is the federal government more powerful on this issue than it's been in the past, or have state governments really asserted their authority and their primacy as governments in terms of exercising more power for that issue? So that's going to be for your second Beach Board essay. And again, please remember to respond to 2 of your classmates. We'll have those posts all due no later than October 3rd. And it sounds strange to say October, but we are just about in October already. So those will all be due by October the 3rd. A second reminder is in terms of the article critiques. Now, do remember that you need to turn in the article critique prior to when we discuss that article in our Zoom session. So for instance, if you want to write a critique on any of the articles, the political aspect articles that we are going to be covering next week, so the Camissa article or the DeWitt article or the Ann Ohm Bowman article or the other Derthick article, then that article critique would then be due no later than 6 o'clock next Wednesday. So again, I just want to reiterate that because it's important in terms of due dates that you have those critiques turned in before we discuss those articles as a class. And again, that's important because I want to see your thoughts and your impressions and interpretations of these articles rather than our interpretations we've had in our discussion in our Zoom sessions. So just make a note of that and make sure that if you are going to do one of the political articles, that the article critique is turned in before 6 o'clock next Wednesday. I think that's all the housekeeping that I have for us tonight. Does anyone have any questions or anything before we get going with our information for the evening? Everyone's good? All right. Very good. As always, if there are any questions that do emerge, feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, either questions about the course or questions about the articles that we are reading. So again, tonight, what we have on our agenda this evening is we're going to finish up our discussion of the background and foundations of American federalism. So that means that we have some articles where we will get to talk about the insights of people like James Madison. We also have an article by Morton Grodzins, who's one of kind of the grandfathers, if you will, of American federalism literature. We also have an article by Deal Wright, and then an article by Martha Durthick. And if my record keeping is accurate, and I believe it is, we'll start tonight with Federalist number 39 by James Madison. And that's one that I will discuss because no one has signed up for that one, which is fine because it's one of my favorite Federalist papers. And so I always look forward to discussing that one. Then we'll move on to Federalist number 10, again by James Madison. And that discussion will be led by Esther. We will then go into the Deal Wright article, the models of national, state, and local relationships. Josh has that one. And I'd like to do that one before I do the Grodzins article, because sometimes the Grodzins article steals the thunder from the Deal Wright article. And so I kind of want Josh to have the ability to lead that discussion. And then I can come in with a discussion of the federal system by Morton Grodzins. And then I'll wrap up the evening with the Paradox in the Middle Tier by Martha Durthick. So that is where we stand for tonight. That's our agenda for this evening. For both Esther and Josh, what I have done is I've enabled screen sharing. So whenever we get to your article, you should then have the ability to share your screen if you want to share slides. So you don't, I know Esther submitted some slides. So I know you have slides. But if you don't want to use slides, you're not required to. But again, I think a lot of people like to use those slides to kind of guide the discussion and kind of be that guide to get us through the discussion of the article. Okay, sound good? All right, let's go ahead. And I have some slides here, and I provided these on the Beachboard site to kind of guide our discussion of the articles that I will be leading the discussion on. So the first one is Federalist number 39. And I talked a little bit last week about James Madison and his co-authorship of the Federalist Papers. And so you know that there are 85 Federalist Papers. 25 of those papers were written by James Madison, but the vast bulk of the Federalist Papers were written by Alexander Hamilton. Madison is an interesting character in that Madison at the Constitutional Convention was really one of the major driving forces at the convention. And he was driving the convention toward the creation of this new Constitution. And he is the author of the bulk of this new US Constitution. So in order to convince the citizens of New York and the anti-federalists who were hesitant to sign off and ratify this new Constitution, he and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay took up the task of writing these Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers, again, were kind of a sales pitch, if you will, to kind of put in today's vernacular, a sales pitch to the citizens of New York to get them to support the Constitution. So as you read some of these Federalist Papers, you can kind of see James Madison and Alexander Hamilton really arguing very strongly for this new Constitution. And so in arguing strongly for the new Constitution, here and there, they will leave out pertinent elements that don't support their argument. So I guess what I'm cautioning you with the Federalist Papers is that they were written with a goal in mind, and that is to get this new Constitution ratified. And as such, they are argumentative in nature. Whenever you write an argumentative piece, sometimes you overlook the information and the evidence that doesn't support your argument, and you just hone in on those arguments that will help you accomplish your goal. And that's what Madison and Hamilton did in a lot of these Federalist Papers. But in Federalist 39, again, it's one of my favorite papers because what Madison does in 39 is I like to say he takes on kind of a social science researcher tact with this article, with this Federalist paper. And he takes the Constitution and he says, let's go ahead and dissect the Constitution in order to show all these people who are hesitant to support it that this new Constitution isn't anything terribly novel, that it's something you have seen before, it's something that you have encountered and should be comfortable with in your states, and it's something that doesn't really centralize power necessarily at the national government level. And it reserves a lot of different powers and a lot of different duties and sovereignty for state governments. So, he starts out giving us this discussion of Republican versus Democratic form of government. And I think that we're all aware that our government is a democratic republic. And again, the small d Democratic and small r Republican, so not the political parties, but we're a democratic form of government when people actively engage in their own self-governance. And so when we go to the ballot box, we have initiatives and referenda, and we support candidates and we lobby Congress. That's a democratic form of government. We are participating in our own self-governance. But those individuals we elect at the ballot box to then go and make decisions for us, that's what makes us a Republican form of government. So in a Republican form of government, we cede power to elected officials to make decisions for us. In a direct democracy, we, the voters, make those decisions ourselves. And so we really have this combination of both a democracy as well as a Republican form of government. Madison then really endeavors to allay the fears of the citizens of New York about this new Constitution by telling them this Constitution isn't much different than the constitutions you've seen in the past. They're not much different than the constitutions that you have in your own individual states. So there's no reason to fear this new Constitution. There's no reason to fear this new national government because you've seen it before. It's nothing that novel. It's nothing that out of the ordinary. And just to give you a few examples, as you read through Federalist 39, at the bottom of page 91 in the most recent version that we're using, the 5th edition, Madison talks about some of the similarities between this new Constitution and what we see in the states. So he argues things like the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, representatives are directly elected by the people. He says, you see that in almost every state. Almost every state has at least one house in their state legislature where representatives are directly elected by the people. The Senate is indirectly elected. And we know that under the original Constitution, all the way up until 1913, with the ratification of the 17th Amendment, members of the Senate were selected by state legislatures rather than being directly elected by the voters. Madison says, again, that's nothing unusual. Look at the Senate in the state of Maryland. The Senate in the state of Maryland has the same type of situation. Says, look at the president. In the presidency, we have terms of office in the president that are not dissimilar to the terms of the chief executive in a lot of our states. 2-year terms for members of the House, not unusual, very similar to the 3 and the 4-year terms, and sometimes the annual elections that we see in states. Even a 6-year term for a member of the U.S. Senate is not that much longer than what we tend to see in our states as well. How we select the president is not that unusual either, in that the president, how we select the president, is kind of a combination of a national and a federal approach, in that we've got this electoral college that will select the president, but then when the electoral college, there's not a majority in the electoral college, then the selection turns to the House of Representatives. But members of the House aren't voting as individuals, they're voting as state delegations. So basically the election gets thrown into the House, which is the body of Congress that is closest to the people. So it's kind of a national type of an approach. But then each congressional delegate gets one vote. And so each congressional delegate will then vote, which makes it more of a federal approach, a more state-oriented approach. So basically he's saying, you've seen this before, so don't be afraid of it. What I think is most compelling, and what we're going to really guide our discussion of number 39 tonight, will be his deconstruction of the Constitution in order to answer the question, is the Constitution national or is the Constitution federal? So most of the article, we'll use quotes, article, if you will, really revolves around this question of, is the Constitution national or is it federal? Now, this takes a little explaining in terms of the word federal. The framers had a different language than we have today. And you probably noticed that as you read through James Madison, if you read Alexander Hamilton especially, you know that it sounds a lot different than the way in which we talk and write today. But the term federal to the framers meant something different than the term federal means to us today. We today use federal and national kind of interchangeably. Sometimes we say the national government, sometimes we say the federal government, but we kind of flip back and forth between those two terms. For the framers, federal really meant what we mean today by a confederation. So when they say a federal government, it's what we think of as a confederal government, in that you have this government being made up of several different sovereign states. Those states have rights, and those states then retain their sovereignty. So when he uses the word federal, it's more like the word confederal that we would use today. So for him, a federation is more what we consider to be a confederation today. So he draws out this binary distinction between a national form of government and a federal form of government that we would view as being a confederal form of government. National form of government, very top-down, centralized, where the power really resides with the national government, and the national government can then exercise those powers over the states, or what he calls a federal government, where the power resides at the state level. So is it national or is it federal? And so he answers this question by, again, deconstructing the Constitution into its component parts. So he says, let's start with the founding of the nation. Was the founding of the nation and the creation of this Constitution national, or was it federal in nature? And what conclusion does he come to? The founding of the nation, was it national or was it federal? Was it controlled by the central government, or was it controlled by the states?
He said the states came first, right? They were the first inceptions of government, and then the federal government would then follow, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. Primacy of state government. And that's a theme that we're going to see throughout tonight, whether we're talking about Madison or whether we're talking about someone like Martha Derthick or Morton Grodzins, that the states were the first governments. And so the argument that Madison is making is that this new Constitution and this new union was formed by state governments. Well, that's a very useful argument for him to make, because it helps support his argument that this new Constitution shouldn't be something that anti-federalists are afraid of, because the states really created it, and so the states have primacy. The problem, though, for us is that what that argument did is it laid the seeds for the Civil War, and it laid the seeds then for Southern state succession. When you think about throughout the 1800s, as the states' rights movement in the South, led by people like John C. Calhoun in the US Senate, when that movement was really starting to gain traction, that was the argument that proponents of secession made, was the states came first, the states created this union, the states created this Constitution, so therefore if the states want to leave this union, they have the constitutional right to do so. And so again, not to turn it into a US history class, but if you remember back to US history, you know that through the 1800s, the 1830s and 40s and 50s, Southern states were very concerned about the institution of slavery. They were very concerned about losing the institution of slavery. They felt that Congress was dominated by Northern states. And they felt that this Northern-dominated Congress was passing laws that were hurting the economic institutions in the South, if you will. And so what Southern states started to do is they started to object to these laws coming out of this quote-unquote Northern-focused Congress. And so the first thing they did is they engaged in a strategy known as interposition. And I'll put that in text chat. But this thing called interposition. Interposition was when southern states tried to stop the implementation of these laws coming out of Congress by using all the resources at their disposal to stop the implementation. So they would take their resources and they would interpose them between the law and its successful implementation. Even back in the 1800s, and especially back in the 1800s, laws that were passed by Congress usually relied upon state governments and even at the local level, local officials to actually successfully implement these policies and these laws. Well, through interposition, southern states just said, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do everything we can to try and confound the successful implementation of this law. So they engaged in interposition. Interposition didn't accomplish what they wanted it to accomplish. So then they moved to a second, stricter type of strategy known as nullification. And nullification is just what it sounds like. They would, whenever a law would be passed by Congress that a southern state disagreed with, the legislature in that southern state would declare that congressional law to be null and void. Well, it's null and void. We view it as being unconstitutional, so therefore we are going to refuse to follow it. So it kind of sounds extreme today for a state to say this federal law is null and void, but that's what southern states started to do. Nullification, when that wasn't enough to remedy, quote unquote, the problem that the southern states felt they had with Congress, then they went to the most extreme measure, and that was secession. And that's what then led to secession in 1861. But again, interposition, nullification, and secession, all those strategies were all based upon this belief that state governments created the Union, so therefore state governments could leave the Union. And they argued they had the constitutional right to leave the Union. So not that Madison could ever foresee this happening, but when Madison made this argument in the 1780s, it became the same argument that people like John C. Calhoun used to support interposition, nullification, and secession among southern states that then led us to the Civil War. But again, I don't want to digress too much on that, but just kind of put it in historical context for you. Again, Madison didn't mean for that to happen, perhaps, but that is what happened over the ensuing generations. So in terms of the founding of the nation, he argues it's federal in nature as opposed to national, in that the states created the Constitution and created the nation. Second question he asked is how about in terms of where powers are derived, where power comes from? Is that national or is that federal? So what conclusion did he come to? Where powers are derived from, is that national or is that federal?
Federal.
Yeah, there's certainly a federal component to it. And he argues, we see the federal component in terms of states having primacy. We see it in terms of things like the US Senate and the equal representation in the US Senate. So there's a very big federal component. How about national? Is there a national component there as well? Especially when you think about Congress.
Well, the operation of the government, the national government is national.
Right. Yeah. And then on the third point, he says that definitely with operation of the government, it's clearly national. You've got individuals who are going to be running the government. And so once you get the operations, it's clearly national. But in terms of where the powers are derived, yes, there's a big federal component when you think about the Senate. When you think about the House of Representatives, there's a little bit more of a national component than what you might see with the Senate. Because you've got direct election of these members of the House as opposed to indirect selection of members of the Senate. So there might be a little national component from there. When you think about the president, how the president is elected, there's a mixture in terms of the selection of the president. So you kind of have a mixture. So he says really where the powers are derived, it's a balance between national and federal approaches. Now, admittedly, his argument for it being federal and the evidence he uses for it being federal Probably is a little bit stronger than national, but he says there's kind of a mixture in terms of where the powers are derived. And as we said, with the third criteria of operation of government, he says this is where he kind of throws his hands up. During the entire article, he really wants to find out that on all these elements, there's a big federal component, because that is what's going to convince the citizens of New York and anti-federalists to support this new constitution. But when it comes to operation of the government, he kind of throws his hands up. He's like, I give up here. Okay, it's going to be national. So on this one, it's national. But when we get to the next one, extent of powers, then we get back to a mixture again. And it becomes both national as well as federal. So what do you say about the extent of powers and being either national or federal in nature? The extent of the power more national government, or is it more states' rights and more state government?
A little bit of both.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a little bit of both there. He says, when you think about it, there's a little bit of both, probably certainly lending itself more to federal than to national, but there are components of both here. In terms of federal, he says, think about, again, states came first. And so states were really the foundation of the nation. He says, think about how this Constitution gets ratified. This Constitution gets ratified not with a simple majority of states. So it wasn't just 7 states to ratify it, it was 9 states. So we needed to go beyond just a simple majority of states. We had to have the agreement of a supermajority of states of 9 states, which gives the states basically veto power over this new Constitution. So for the Constitution to even be ratified, you have to have an overwhelming majority of states signing off on the Constitution and saying they are okay with it and that they support this new Constitution. So how about amending the Constitution? When we amend the Constitution, is that national or is that federal in nature?
I believe he says it's federal in nature.
Yeah, he said there's a very heavy federal component to it. States have to ratify amendments to the Constitution. But on the proposal side, amendments can be proposed by a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate. And even though the House and the Senate are populated by representatives from the states, those are national legislative bodies. And so on the proposal side, there's a national component. On the ratification side, there's a very heavy federal component. So it kind of weighs a little bit more federal, but there are elements of both national and federal. So how we amend the Constitution is kind of a conglomeration of both. He says his final conclusion, then, when you put all of this together, you look at all these 5 different criteria he looked at, and the comparison of the Constitution being either national or federal, he says it is a combination of the two. And he basically is making the argument that the Constitution is the perfect compromise between the national approach and the federal approach. It empowers Congress, but it also limits some of those powers of Congress through the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. It reserves other powers than for state governments. So it's both national as well as federal in character. So I think what he is doing is he, again, is trying to convince these anti-federalists that, this rhetoric that this Constitution is creating a overpowerful, if you will, national government is just that. It's just rhetoric. When you really dig into the Constitution, you find out that the Constitution balances both a national as well as a federal approach. And there are very strong provisions in the Constitution to protect the sovereignty and the powers of state governments. Again, I think this is a really important article for us to begin with, because this, like all the other Federalist Papers, really provide us with some good insight into what the framers really meant by the words that they wrote in that Constitution and the words that Madison wrote in the Bill of Rights. And they're intentional, and they are intentional for the purpose of creating this compromise document that would alleviate and mitigate the concerns of those anti-federalists who had essentially lost the convention. The anti-federalists are the ones who lost the majority of the convention, because a lot of those anti-federalists would have been very happy just keeping the articles and not replacing them with the new constitution. So, whenever you're the loser in a battle, you're going to have some hurt feelings and you're going to have some reservations. Well, this is the way in which he was trying to smooth over some of those hurt feelings and to try and convince them that this new constitution is going to give you what you want, and you don't have to worry about being controlled by this too strong central national government. But again, read through Federalist 39 again, because again, I think it really gives us this basis for understanding the Constitution from the perspective of federalism and from the perspective of the proper balance of power between national and state governments. And that this compromise document known as the Constitution provides that necessary balance, according to Madison in Federalist Paper number 39. So that's Federalist 39. Are there any other observations or comments on Federalist 39 and Madison's thinking? Again, we have limited time in this class, obviously, as a 6-week class, so we can only spend the first couple of weeks on background and foundation. So we can't go through a majority of the Federalist Papers, but a couple of other Federalist Papers that Madison wrote that also shine light on this argument about the proper balance between national and state governments. Federalist Paper 45 and Federalist Paper 46 also talk about these similar types of issues. But I think it really gets crystallized very well in Federalist 39, and so that's why that is the Federalist paper that we start off with and assign for this course. Okay, with that being said, as our background, we then have another Federalist paper we talked about in this class, and that's another one by Madison, and that's Federalist paper number 10. That belongs to Esther. So Esther, I will turn the floor over to you. I believe that I've enabled the screen sharing, so you should be able to share your screen. If not, let me know and I can share it for you. Oh, there you go. You got it shared. All right, the floor is yours, Esther.
Okay, I was on mute. Okay, can everybody see the slides? Okay, good. Okay, well, it's very good to see everybody again after 12 weeks, and I hope everyone is doing well. I believe most of you have already known me from other classes. If not, my name is Esther Tong, and I'm going to present Federalist number 10 written by James Madison tonight. As you can see, I'm a big fan of the Broadway show Hamilton, and I just watched it in Pantages Theater about 3 weeks ago, and it was absolutely amazing. So if you are in the area, I highly recommend you watched it. If you're not in the area, maybe watch it on Disney Plus. If you have a chance, and you gave a little glimpse of the U.S. history. Well, it might not be all correct, but it's, fun fact. So I'm eager to jump in to be among the first ones to lead the discussions tonight because of Hamilton, okay? And most of us who took U.S. history, back in middle school, high school, or undergrad, learned that the Federalists, commonly referred as the Federalist Papers, is a series of 85 essays written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison between October 1787 and May 1788. The essays were published anonymously under the pen name Publius in various New York State newspapers of the time. It is very interesting to note that the pen name Publius is making reference to one of the ancient Roman aristocrats who overthrew the Roman kingdom in the late 6th century to establish the Roman Republic. So one way to think about it is that Madison is viewing himself and other Federalists is trying to establish a strong republic. This is also in comparison to Brutus, which we see as the pen name for some of the significant anti-Federalist papers. And Brutus plays a significant role in assassination of Julius Caesar to keep him from corrupting the Republic, ending the Republic and turning into an empire. So that's, just some fun fact for the pain name Publius and Brutus. And the Federalist Papers were written and published to urge New Yorkers to ratify the proposed United States Constitution, which was drafted in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. In lobbying for adoption of the Constitution of the 16 Articles of Confederation, the essays explain particular provisions of the Constitution in detail. For this reason, and because Hamilton and Madison were each members of the Constitution Convention, the Federalist Papers are often used today to help interpret the intention of those drafting the Constitution. Perhaps the most famous among the essays were Federalist Number 10, published on November 22, 1787. And the primary purpose of Federalist Number 10 was to counter the recent assertion of anti-Federalist John Yates, a former convention delegate who spearheaded the opposition to the Constitution under the pen name Brutus, as mentioned earlier. And so what is Federalist Number 10 about? What is it so important? Is anybody have any idea? I can give a little spoiler alert. It's actually in the title and in the first sentence. What is Federalist Number 10 about? One main theme. Anybody?
I have something.
Okay.
And so I don't know if everybody remembers, but didn't we read this in 500 as well?
Yes.
So it was funny to go back and look at my notes that I made then, and now, a year and a half later, sort of digest it again. But it seems to me that it's really an argument for a republic versus a direct democracy, right? And sort of ameliorating the extreme views. He calls them factions here.
Right. You got it.
Of
Faction.
not the elite, but of the common man. Not of the elite, but of the common man.
Right. So here it is. Okay, it's actually talks about faction, right? And then he says, in the well-constructed union needs to be able to break and control the violence. Actually, it's in the last slide. Oops, how do I go back here? Okay, so here it says, a well-constructed union needs to be able to break and control the violence of faction. And as in the title, the union is a safeguard against domestic faction and the insurrection. So really, Federalist Number 10 is about faction, like Kathy mentioned, and then the potential solution to faction and how the Constitution is able to establish a government capable of controlling the violence and damage caused by factions. So do anybody remember what faction really means? That we learned from PPA 500. Kathy mentioned a little bit. Anybody else want to give it a try, a shout out?
If I remember from 500, I think it's like a small group that kind of breaks off from the bigger political group.
Yes, thank you, Julian. Okay, here, sorry, I'm trying to find my notes. So Madison defined here by faction, I understand the number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, averse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So what is, simply speaking, faction is a group of citizens that they are united by some common interest or purpose, averse to the rights of other citizens. Today we'll call them like a special interest group. And then the factions are not limited to political parties, so they can frequently be formed within any group. And it can be any ideologies or any financial purpose, doesn't have to be political. Okay, so and then right after Madison defined faction, he proposed two potential solutions to control the problem. This problem of faction, this problem of majority, rule overrunning minorities or the rights of the minorities. One is to remove the cause of factions, and the other is to control the effects of factions. Then he explained there are two ways that you could remove the cause of action. The first way is to destroy liberty, which is probably worse than the problem itself and unwise. And the other way is to give everybody the same opinion, which is almost impossible and impractical. So neither of these two ways of removing the cause of factions will work. So we are only left with one possibility, which is to control the negative effects of factions. It is natural for men to form factions. And it's mentioned earlier that this problem of faction, the majority rule overrunning minorities or the rise of the minorities is Madison's main concern. To Madison, the key is making sure that majority factions are unable to oppress minority factions, even if they want to. But how is it possible? So Madison said either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority having such coexistent passion or interest must be rendered by their number and local situations unable to correct and carry into effect schemes of oppression. Simply speaking, we have to make it impossible for the majority faction to carry out its objective. But how do you stop the majority from doing what it wants to do that might not be beneficial for other people, especially the minority? So this is the important, really important, that what type of government will be best able to handle that power of majority faction. And really there are only two choices that could be considered, which is the democracies and republics. And it's different than what we understand what democracies and republics in modern world. So democracy at the time is pure democracy, a direct democracy or participatory democracy, a society with a small number of citizens who vote directly on policies, which Madison here is not in favor of. To Madison, a democracy cannot control factions. Therefore, majorities will continue to oppress minorities, take over, trample over the rights of everyone else, and there's nothing to check the majority. On the other hand, Madison defined the definition of the republic. It's a situation where you have the people being represented by others. We already saw that Madison is not a fan of participatory or pure democracy. And here he's saying, if you take the views and pass them through the median of a chosen body of citizens, and these people might represent the public better than the people themselves. Madison continues to argue that since it is easy to have a majority in a smaller society, whether it is republic or a democracy government, it is easy to have a majority that oppresses the minority. However, if you extend the sphere, meaning that you're taking more people, have a larger area that is under this government, you will have a greater variety of parties, you will have more interests, and then it's less likely that the majority will have the common motive to invade the rights of the citizens. So what do you think if the solution is any way to control the negative effect of faction, as Madison mentioned? So he kind of explained it in the previous slides. So is it in a simple way to explain what's the solution that he proposed?
I mean, I think that his solution is having a republic versus a direct democracy, right? And so electing people who represent, electing elite people to represent large groups of people, assuming that those elite people will also not tend toward these extremes. But because they're better educated, they will be, more level-headed, I guess.
Right, you got it. You got the right point. He is actually, he want to Madison to control the problem of factions is to have a republic government. Madison praised a Republican form of government, that the idea we will be able to have better representatives, people who are more knowledgeable, like Kathy said, wiser and with probably higher education, more experiences. And since they have the higher perspective of what's best for the nation, they will be less likely to oppress minorities than people people in the democracy would, if they are voting on the policy directly themselves. Madison also proposed to have more factions, because with more factions, that will dilute the power that each faction has, which will make it less likely to have a majority faction oppress the rights of others. And finally, Federalist number 10, it's all about the larger public is the best way to control the negative effects of action and to protect minority rights while maintaining the majority rules. Okay. All right, that concludes my presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Great job, Esther. It's
Thank
beautiful.
you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Esther.
Let me figure out how do I stop sharing.
I like how you have credits and everything.
Yeah, this is actually a great slides. I find it online.
Mhm,
It's called Slides Go.
uh-huh.
And then they have all the pages ready. You can just change the titles and words and everything.
Yeah, that's neat.
Just stop
Yeah, very-
sharing.
Very, very well done, Esther. And I agree.
Thank you.
The slides were excellent. And that's something I'm deficient in, the quality of my slides. So you certainly put me to shame with that. But that was very engaging, very well done. And
Thank you.
you hit all the important points of Federalist number 10. I'm very happy to hear that you all got to read Federalist 10 in 500. That reassures me. It makes me feel much better, because we did a redesign of 500 a few years ago, and we now make, as you know, because you lived through 500, now it really kind of gives that basis in American government that we never really had before in the 500 class. And so, as Esther said, this Federalist paper number 10 is one of the most often cited and most talked about Federalist paper in the entire 85 paper collection. But as Esther points out, what Madison is saying is, he's saying, how can we control these factions? Because the problem is, as Esther said, you can't eliminate factions, because as Madison said, if you eliminate the causes of factions, you're eliminating liberty. You're basically taking personal liberty away from people, and you can't do that, because that's at the very heart of a democracy itself. So the best we can do is try and control the effects of these factions, so that one faction does not become too powerful. This whole idea, as Esther talked about, of Madison advocating for a larger government, a larger government over a greater jurisdiction with even more factions that could balance other factions, that's what came to be known as a compound republic. And that type of compound republic is really what Madison was advocating. At the time, from the perspective of political philosophy, that was a pretty revolutionary, no pun intended, type of idea, because the prevailing philosophy at the time was a philosophy put forth by Montesquieu, another philosopher, who argued for a compact republic. And so according to Montesquieu and other philosophers at the time, again, this goes beyond Federalist 10, so this isn't something that Esther should have had in her discussion, so this kind of goes beyond that. But Montesquieu and his adherents at the time argued that the way in which you run an efficient and effective government is you have a small government over a very small jurisdiction, populated by people who have very homogeneous opinions and very homogeneous thoughts. So you don't have those types of factions. Madison turned that entire idea on its head, and he said, no, we don't need a compact republic, we need a compound republic. Because if we have more factions, then it's easier to then balance one faction against another faction, so one faction does not become too overly powerful. So this idea of the compound republic, was something, again, revolutionary at the time, but our system of government is really predicated upon this idea of a compound republic balancing faction against faction. The question then is, this is a question that Esther got to on her last slide. I think it's a really important question is, so Madison's preferred approach is to control the effects of factions with this compound republic. So we do have a compound republic today. The question is, how well has it worked? Do you feel that today the compound republic of Madison is effectively controlling factions so one faction does not become too powerful?
No.
No.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, you're right. I mean, I think we look at it and it's not working the way in which I think it was supposed to work. The big question is why? Why do you think it's not working the way in which Madison may have envisioned?
Well, okay, so I think I remember reading this the first time, feeling like it felt a little naive about the human nature of people, right? So it presupposes that because someone is better educated, that they're not going to tend toward an extreme view. And I think what we're seeing is that is absolutely not the case in a super hyper-polarized environment like we're in now.
Yeah, and you know what? To bolster Kathy's argument there, I've read several social science studies that have said because you're more educated, it probably means you're more likely to be some sort of institutionalist, but you would also not veer towards the center, but more towards your ideology already. So you're seeing that sort of play out now in real life, right? Like it seems like every time one of the political parties is in the minority, the debt ceiling comes up and they throw a tantrum. And that faction is trying to pull on some sort of leverage to get what they want. So, and, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer are both highly educated people.
Anybody else? Any other? I think that I think it's very true. And what Kathy said about this distrust in kind of really a distrust in average citizens. The framers, they were elites. I mean, they were the property owners. They were the creditors, as we talked about last week. They were rich, and so they did have this distrust in the average citizen. You can see that in the conventions. Again, no pun intended. The conventions in the Constitution itself. Things like the Electoral College. The way the Electoral College was supposed to work is that the president is selected by these electors. Well, the framers envisioned these electors as not coming from political parties necessarily. They envisioned them as being, the highly educated aristocracy who could then serve as a check on popular opinion and could make sure that we get a qualified president in the office of the presidency. That's not the way the Electoral College works today. The Electoral College today is dominated by the political parties. Each party will have its slate of electors, and then if you win the popular vote in the vast majority of states, 48 out of 50, you win the popular vote in that state, then that slate of electors will then go to the state capitol and will then vote for that for that person who won their state, and that's the person from their political party. So the Electoral College is dominated by political parties. That wasn't the way in which Electoral College was originally envisioned by the framers. Even think about George Washington. And George Washington, really chastised us about political parties. And he basically said, don't do it. Don't form political parties because political parties will render the country asunder. And so it's not working the way in which the Electoral College was supposed to work, but it was there to try and serve as a check on the passions of average, ordinary citizens. The U.S. Senate, they were selected by state legislatures. That's not a mistake. The framers did that on purpose, made the upper house of Congress, the Senate, being indirectly selected as opposed to directly elected. Well, what types of powers do they give to the Senate? Oh, just little powers like, treaty approval and approval of appointees. And they have the real big power in Congress resides in the Senate, these indirectly elected senators. And so I think it's true that there was this distrust for average, ordinary citizens that the framers really had. But
And an inordinate level of trust for the elite.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe
Absolutely.
that was appropriate then. I just don't find that through the, last 200 however many years, maybe it's not true anymore.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, the Constitution, it was a sign of the times, and the
Mhm.
framers, the way in which they wrote the Constitution, they were men of the time, and so I think it's true that it's a different world today than it certainly was then.
And they
So-
were generally principled men, and they couldn't contemplate that someone in their position would not have the same principles.
Right, absolutely. And actually, Hamilton wrote about that a lot in several Federalist papers, and every now and then during the past 2 impeachment trials, people actually reference Alexander Hamilton and some of the things that he wrote about that. And yeah, it was difficult for them to even envision not having their, what they expected to be, someone who be beyond reproach and things like that in the Oval Office. So not that there was Oval Office then, but you get the idea. So yeah, and I think there are some other problems, and so I don't want to belabor this too much because we need to go on to Josh's article. But I think also when you're looking at how factions interact today, a lot of the interaction is based upon money, isn't it? Especially when you think about special interest groups. It's which special interest group is able to form the pact that will give the money to the elected official, for that elected official to then turn a kind ear to that interest group. It wasn't that situation necessarily in the 1780s. And so I think the way in which that has morphed today, I think also kind of undermines this compound republic approach to controlling the effects of these factions. The way in which we do elections today is a lot different. When you look at congressional districts in the House of Representatives, the vast majority of those congressional districts are safe districts. Now, these are districts that the party is not going to lose come hell or high water because of the way they've gerrymandered the districts. So what does that mean? That means that if you're a representative from that safe district, you're not worried about the general election. You don't care a bit about the general election. You're worried about the primary. You don't want to get primary. And so what does that do? That then pushes elected officials to the extremes. And so they either go to the extreme left or the extreme right. And what do you have? You then have extreme factions. And so I think, just the way in which our system works today kind of confounds this whole approach with the compound republic. So, but I'll get off my soapbox. It always feels good to get on the soapbox every now and then, but it is a different world today. And it just, some of the conventions and some of the approaches in 1780s may not fit quite as well today as they did then. So, okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for it's a good discussion. Thank you, Esther, again. Excellent discussion leader. So well done. That's how we do it. And so I'm glad Esther, I always have great respect for Esther and Josh for, going on this first night and kind of setting the standard for all of us. I know that's hard to do when, you haven't seen someone do it before necessarily in a federalism class and you go and you do it. I really do have great respect for that. So thank you to both of you. And Josh, I will stop talking and turn the floor over to you for the discussion of Deal Right.
All right. Let's see. So this wasn't my first choice, so I wouldn't have gone the first week, but here we are. My slides aren't as elegant as Esther's, but more the meat and potatoes, but we'll get there. Let me just present here. So yeah, I'm going to be discussing Wright's article on the models of national, state, and local relationships. So in the article, he discusses 3 types of models in relation to authority relationships among the national, state, and local levels of government. Really, these models are kind of in their simplest form. They don't really show the complexities and the realities of what government really is. It doesn't really show the number and types of entities, the number of personnel that are involved, the different types of programs and functions, and the different financial resources that are involved at each level. But really just shows a general overview of those relationships between national, state, and local. The first one we'll look at is the the coordinated authority model. Then we'll look at the dominant or inclusive authority, and then we'll wrap it up with the equal or overlapping authority. So under the coordinate authority model, you can kind of see that there's a distinction between the national and the state. The local units are obviously housed in that state level, and really the locals are really dependent upon the state, and are really their power is really specifically granted to them by the state. So the article refers to Dillon's rule, and Judge John F. Dillon in 1868, his rule was kind of derived from two court decisions, which there was that narrow interpretation of kind of local government and where they fell within their powers, and really locality, really engages in certain activities and decisions really based on and are sanctioned by the state government. So really the state government has control over the local government. So if anybody did read the article, so according to Dillon's rule, kind of what are those power relations that we see between states and their localities? So there's kind of like 4 points within the article that he talks about. So essentially, locals are kind of the entity, or like kind of the creatures of the state. They're kind of bound by the discretion of the state, granted, bearing, constitutional limitations. There's no common law right or self-government. They really exercise, like I said, the powers that were expressed or granted to them. And really, they're just kind of tenants of the legislature. So Dillon's rule only kind of focuses on state and local government, and it's really not a clear, accurate representation of kind of that intergovernmental relation. But what does like coordinate authority? What does that model imply about like national and state power relationships? So if we go back to that model, we saw that distinction. What does it imply about the national and the state government?
It looks like it implies that the national government exists outside of the state government, right?
Right.
And it's really sort of its own entity. And that the national and state governments are really just separate.
Right. So yeah, it implies, like you said, there's two separate entities. They're really independent and autonomous to each other, and they're really linked only tangentially. There were they kind of govern and fall within their own sphere of authority. But then you look at it, what happens in the case where you have a conflict between the national government and the state, and there's a clash between the two. So in the article, Wright presents two separate court cases, one that represented autonomy, where there was a separation of the national and the state, and then another where there was a sign of the national government having their power over the state and having some control. So in 1976, in the court, the Supreme Court decision in the National League of Cities versus Usuri, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court, let's see here. So Congress didn't have, so what they ruled is that Congress didn't have the authority to require the state or local governments to observe the minimum wage or the maximum hour laws. And they said it was kind of in violation to the state sovereignty and for their ability to govern and represent or hold that power to themselves. What a lot of people who study this, what they saw with this court decision was that there was significant in a sense that it showed that in the 10th Amendment, it guarded the state's interests and reassured their interests in relation to national power. Let's see, the limitations of the amendment. So it defines the 10th Amendment limitations based on the state and local governments as integral operations and activities that involve traditional functions. And then also there was unconstitutional infringement, the option for state and local governments to control and direct their own operations. So in the second case that the article presented, this was Garcia versus the San Antonio Metropolitan Transportation Authority. So in the case, the San Antonio Metropolitan Authority was the main provider of transportation in the San Antonio metropolitan area. They claim that they were exempt from those minimum wage standards and those overtime requirements under the Fair Labor Standards Act. But again, in another 5-4 decision delivered by Justice Harry Blackmun, the court essentially rejected what was ruled in the Usuri case, and they determined that those integral or traditional government functions provided no guidance in determining those boundaries of federal and state power. So essentially you kind of see those two cases and how, again, you see autonomy in the other where the state was able to kind of make their own power, their own decisions. And in the second one, in Garcia versus San Antonio, we see the opposite where the national government has power over the state. So now we're going to move on to the next model, the inclusive authority model. So as you can see, you see the circles kind of diminishing in size from national, state, and local, and kind of represents their power. Now, if you look at, suppose the national government wanted to expand its power, there's kind of two different strategies that are possible. So one is to reduce the various powers of either the states or the localities, and the other is to enlarge kind of the national government circle without either enlarging the state or the local. So this term is what they term this enlarging the pie. So what are the two strategies? So as I discussed, those are the two strategies. So now we go to what is known as game theory. So this systematic theory. So what is game theory? So game theory is kind of a systematic way of studying behavior and the decision-making process. So in the sense of national, state, and local governments, they're looking to kind of optimize their behavior and trying to maximize their gains and minimize their losses within, their allowed behavior. The outcomes depend, those outcomes not only depend on the behavior of one participant, but the entire group as well. So there are two types of strategies, type 1 and 2. Does anybody know what type 1 strategy is when it comes to game theory?
Zero-sum game.
Zero-sum game. So yeah, so kind of like poker. So zero-sum game, where players' winnings equals the sum of everybody's losses, right? Or the other's losses. So when we look back at those court cases in Usuri versus Garcia, legislation required state and local units to meet that minimum wage and maximum hour requirements. So the national government kind of exercised or tried to expand their power in that sense, and that was at the expense of your state and local powers. So that gain in national power equaled the power lost by both the state and the local units.
Zero sum assumes that there's limited resources. There's a certain amount that's going to be divided up between certain entities.
Right. So that kind of brings us to like type 2. So does anybody know what type 2 is for game theory?
Increasing the resources.
Say again.
Everybody can win.
Yeah, just make there you have more resources. So one group taking more resources, it doesn't mean another group loses that same amount of resources. You're enlarging the pie.
You're right. So you're enlarging the pie. It's a non-constant sum game. So all participants in this type, essentially are winning or making gains. So this is more of like a fiscal type situation. So the article references the conditional grant and aid. So the national sector can kind of expand or raise more money to offer grants to the states and localities. The funds are offered with conditions, can be termed as losses that are imposed upon the state or local, but they're the benefits that we see, the winnings are attractive, that in a sense they kind of outweigh those attached constraints that they have on them when they do receive, grant those types of aids. So from these two strategies, we kind of see within, the national intergovernmental relations, we see policies that kind of lean towards the type 2, that non-constant sum game. But at what point would you kind of see where this type 2 strategy not really work, or this wouldn't be the choice, the ideal choice?
Well, I mean, I think that more resources means usually higher taxes, right? The money has to come from somewhere.
So yeah, being that fiscal strategy. So
Yeah.
really it depends on, the allocation and what's coming in. So really we've heard that the term like cutback management, we've talked about, doing more with less. So really it's dependent upon, those aids and those funds being available. So, more recently you kind of see that shift from that type 2 strategy to more of a type 1. So when looking at the inclusive authority model, how well do you think that fits into the U.S., our U.S. politics, policy, and administration? Is this something that you see fits within our system, or do you feel like it's obsolete?
Sure, I think it fits, and I think we still use it. I just don't think that it captures,
System.
everything. Yeah, the entire system. So you had the two examples of either the zero sum game or the non-constant sum, and I was thinking right now, well, the drinking age is regulated by state law, right? However, to get money for the federal highway system, the federal government said, we'll allocate this money for your roads if you raise the drinking age. And so all of a sudden, all the drinking ages went up. And I was thinking about something that's happening now. You have the vaccine mandate. Well, the vaccine mandate, you're mandating people to get a vaccine. It's so you look at it in terms of rights or loss of something, you lose the right to either get a vaccine or not. So you see the zero sum game being played there. So I think that they're both still applied, right?
Yeah, I mean, we see them in all areas now. I mean, it may not be the dominant model that we see in our system, but yeah, it is exercised, in various ways that you mentioned. So really the idea is ultimately like who governs who. So, like you're saying, there's examples where the state holds that power in the implementation. Then again, on the national level, you see how they hold the power as well.
You can see this too in some, maybe not fiscally, but in some public policy things like marriage equality, abortion rights, right? So, and we're seeing it go the other direction in some cases right now with, and with the Supreme Court always being the arbiter or the sort of the final word on what's constitutional and what isn't. So anyway, yeah. So not every state had marriage equality, but a couple of states passed marriage equality, and then the federal government passed marriage equality again as a Supreme Court judgment.
Yeah, I mean, there's many that in the article it talks about, different different individuals. There's Senator Joseph Clark. Looking back as well as 1960, he saw the kind of that national federalism as he looked at the national government as kind of the not only the entity that was in charge, but that should be in charge. So it talks about the idea of kind of the Great Society. So with 89th Congress, when they created the core of the Great Society, they enacted Medicare, federal aid to education, high-speed mass transit, rental supplements, environmental safety regulations. So all those things kind of represented kind of more of a national approach to governance. And he talks about how the Great Society was defined as one society. It's singular, not plural. There's a centralization of objective setting. So he emphasized kind of a single system. But you can kind of look at it as a different approach, because we talked about, before we talked about the power elites. So there's the power leader perspective. So you see that there's a significance in that these groups or these individuals have a strong influence on governmental power and what takes place or what is passed, and the influence that they have. You also have the private interest groups. You have large corporate enterprises and things like that who have influence as well. And really, you kind of see, it talks about, you see how the states kind of don't really have that influence, and it's more, a lot of the power is given to the national government. So looking at the last model, we have the overlapping authority model. So we saw the two previously. They're kind of they have a little bit of they're kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, but he talks about this third model being as the most representative of the intergovernmental relationship practice. And you can see, there's a substantial area within the center where you have, there's a lot of involvement with the national, state, and local units. The areas of singular jurisdiction, that autonomy, it's really small. So it's really lies within that interaction between all levels of government. And there's this model is kind of termed that bargaining model. So let's see, I think I covered that. So that the bargaining model, you can see that when is bargaining used within intergovernmental relations? So are there any examples that we see in government today where we see this bargaining taking place between local, state, and national government? Do we have any examples of that?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about education funding. Right now, in states where executive orders have prevented mask mandates, and the federal government saying that they would make up funding to those schools, because state schools are funded by states, right? So it's the whole thing is in constant conflict. But the federal government saying that they'd make up the fund loss for those schools if they still did mask mandates and were not getting state funding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example right now. Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a bunch of assistance programs that we see that go to state and the locals from the national government. But again, it's an exchange for their agreement, implementation of that program and carrying it out. Of course, there's always that with bargaining, there's always some type of like conditions of approval, either matching funds for the program, the accounting, the reporting, the auditing of it. So there's always that catch with that when you have those bargaining agreements between the other levels of government. Other examples that the article presents, the city annexation of county territories in Virginia was an example. Urban development action grants that were used by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the early 1970s was also another example, and that being between the local and national bargaining. So again, So looking kind of to wrap up this model, kind of what are the characteristic features of kind of the overlapping authority model? So just going back to that diagram, what does it kind of encompass within this model? So we have, limited and dispersed power. There's really those uncertain areas of autonomy. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of competition and cooperation. There's that bargaining exchange relationship. And there's a lot of negotiations as a way of reaching that strategy for reaching agreements. So the article does mention that this overlapping authority model is kind of the more relevant and more pertinent to government today. So I don't know if everybody feels the same way. I feel like each model is kind of used in somewhere or another. But yeah, that's all I had. I don't know why I went back.
Thank you, Josh.
Good
Any
job.
questions?
Josh, your slides are good too.
Great job.
Good job, Josh. Great job.
Yeah, Josh, you put me to shame as well. So
Great
I'm gonna have to step up my slide game a little bit. So, but well done. Yeah, and you hit the major points of the article. The primary reason why we read this article are those three different models, and those three models that Deal Wright developed really have guided the way in which we look at the relationship between different levels of government throughout the different eras of our over 200-year history of American federalism. And so the author does argue that the more germane one for today is probably the overlapping authority model. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, it was certainly more of a coordinate authority type of model. During the Johnson administration, the War on Poverty, Great Society, it really became much more the inclusive authority model. But the importance of the article really is that here are the three different models. And I think, Josh, you're probably right that there's a role for each of these models depending upon the issue. One of the trends that we have seen in American federalism is that federalism today is much more issue-oriented than it's ever been in the past. It used to be in federalism that if you knew the ideology of a decision maker, if you knew that person was a conservative or a liberal, a Republican or a Democrat, you could do a pretty good job of guessing which level of government they would support having the power reside at. And so if you're a more conservative, you probably be more states' rights. If you're a more liberal, you probably be more centralized, national government power. It's not always that case now, and it's a much more issue-based approach to federalism. And so I think you're right. It's probably dominant is overlapping authority, but we can find some instances of inclusive authority where the federal government has come along and said, state governments, you no longer even have the legal ability to make laws in this policy area. One issue that jumps off the top of my mind is in internet taxation. Years ago, I did a lot of work in internet taxation. There's a type of tax called an internet access tax, where states could tax your access to the internet. So every month you would pay a fee to your internet service provider for them to provide you with access to the internet, and the state would then tax that fee. Well, Congress came in several years ago and said, you can no longer do that, states. And they fully preempted the states from being able to use those internet access taxes. That's very much of an inclusive authority model. It's a national government saying, we're telling you, you can't do it. There's a finite amount of political power here, and we are going to wield that political power, and you will have zero political power in that arena. So for some issues in contemporary federalism, we do on occasion see an inclusive authority model. On some issues, there is more separation between federal and state governments. It looks a little bit more like coordinate authority. But the one that kind of carries the day for the most part is that overlapping authority model of federalism. There's a lot that can be said about the NLC versus usury case and the Garcia versus SAMHSA case. And a lot of people were shocked in the Garcia case because here's the Supreme Court that 9 years later, they're completely abandoning one of their judicial precedents. Imagine that, the Supreme Court abandoning a judicial precedent. Well, it happens. We talk a lot about stare decisis. We talk a lot about the role of precedent in judicial decisions. Sometimes the Supreme Court, the composition changes, and the Supreme Court completely abandons their original precedent. Well, that's what happened in the National League of Cities versus Usury compared to Garcia versus Samtha cases. It's the Supreme Court that makes these ultimate decisions about the interpretation of, is it coordinate authority, is it overlapping authority, is it inclusive authority. The utility of these three models will become very clear after our break when we get into the Morton-Grodzins discussion, and I will then present to you how I view the past 200 years of American federalism and the different eras we have gone through in American federalism and which era correlates with which of those three models from the Deal Right article. So the big utility from the article is going to come after the break. But I know we're almost at 7:30, so thank you, Josh. Well done. You had all the major points of the article, so thank you for that. Let's go ahead and take a break. I think we're at, 7:26. Let's take about a 15-minute break, and then let's come back after the break, and then I will do the Grodzins article, I'll do the Derthik article, and kind of wrap up our background and foundations approach for tonight. So take 15 minutes, come back, and we'll do our two last articles. Okay, everyone. Well, we are back. Hope you had a good break. And I'll try not to keep you here all evening since the last two articles we're going to cover both are mine to do. So since I'm not grading myself on the way in which I lead the discussion, then a little bit of flexibility tonight. So I'll try not to keep you here all night long. Let me double check, make sure we're recording again. I believe we are. And okay. So the next article that we discuss is this article by Morton-Grodzins. And I think I had mentioned before that Morton-Grodzins is a very well-known federalism author. He usually wrote a lot of his pieces in combination with his student, Daniel Elazar. So oftentimes you'll see Grodzins and Elazar because they wrote as a tandem for most of the second half of Grodzins' career and a majority of Elazar's career. This article, though, is just by Morton-Grodzins. And in this article, Grodzins is making an argument to us that there never really was a coordinate authority model. Before the break, Josh talked to us about Deal Right's coordinate authority and overlapping authority and inclusive authority models. The common understanding among federalism scholars was that the early years of American federalism, the late 1700s and the 1800s, were really marked by that coordinate authority model of federalism, whereby the national government had its duties and responsibilities, and state governments had a separate sphere of influence for their duties and their responsibilities, and never the two shall meet. And so the two spheres do not overlap with each other, hence why they are coordinate types of spheres. That was the general understanding among federalism scholars. Grodzins tries to turn that on its head, and Grodzins tries to argue that, well, there never really was a coordinate authority model. That even back in the 1700s and the 1800s, we had this overlapping authority model in that there were always shared functions, regardless of the policy, regardless of the issue. Functions were always shared between levels of government. Now, the degree of sharing may not have been great, but there was sharing involved between the different levels of government. The way in which Grodzins goes about doing this is he starts his article by giving us this example of what he calls the sanitarian. And the sanitarian is basically like a health officer, what we call a health officer today. And he says, well, let's take a look at this individual, the sanitarian, and how all of the different levels of government influence what the sanitarian is doing. So he says, when you think about it, the sanitarian's salary, his base salary, is coming from federal as well as state funds. And so federal and state government are involved in paying this individual for the work that they are doing. The sanitarian's office is being provided by the county. So the county's involved. The city is involved because they also duly hire him as a city plumber. And so they're paying part of his salary. The mandates that he's implementing in his role as a sanitarian are state and sometimes federal mandates. And so this is kind of an exaggerated example that Grodson uses to show you that all the levels of government interact, even with this one very simple position like a sanitarian or a health officer. He then tells us that as we go look throughout history, we've always tried to unravel the federal relationship. We've always tried to unravel the relationship between the different levels of government, and we've never quite been able to do it. And we've never quite been able to unravel this relationship between federal and state and local governments because they've always been so intertwined with each other. So it is kind of a shift in the way in which we look at relationship between levels of government, with Grodson's now saying everything's always been intertwined. It's always been an overlapping authority model. It's never just been a pure coordinated authority model, even back in the 1700s and the 1800s. Well, why? Well, the primary reasons why is that power has always been dispersed between levels of government. Power has never been consolidated just at the national level or consolidated just at the state level, but power is dispersed across all these levels of government vertically through our system of American federalism. So the big question he then asks is, why has power always been dispersed? Why is power not centralized? Why has power always been decentralized? So my question to you is, what conclusions did he arrive at? Why has power always been decentralized in our system of American federalism? Any reasons?
I think the first one that he mentioned was the same one that Madison mentioned, where the states had arrived first and people had a strong identity to their locale, and that's really where sort of they got their identity from, and then government sort of formed from there. So that inception. And then I also think another one was why they were looking toward a democratic government. They really sort of feared centralized power. There's always been a notion in the United States that centralized power is bad, and dispersed power is a check on that centralized power.
Right, exactly. Very well said. Yeah, and you hit on all the major points. Yeah, the states were the primacy of the states, like you said, just like Madison talked about, the states came first. And since the states came first, they've always had that primacy advantage over the national government. So it just stands to reason that power has always been decentralized to state levels. As you also mentioned correctly, the distrust in centralized government. When you think about when the Constitution was written and when this new union was formed, we kind of had countervailing pressures being placed upon the framers. The framers felt pressure from, state power, obviously from the Articles, Confederation, and Anti-Federalists, but they also had this concern about too strong of a central government in their experience with the king and with the monarchy. So there was always this distrust in monarchies and always this distrust in central government. And that distrust is really what our entire nation was founded on, and the predicate for revolution to begin with. As you also correctly say, pride in state government also means that power is going to be decentralized. Think about when someone in the late 1700s went across the sea to Europe. And if they went visiting Europe and someone asked them, "Where are you from?" they would say, "I'm a Virginian," or "I'm a New Yorker," "I'm a Pennsylvanian," "I'm a South Carolinian." They would always identify first with their state. Not true today. I think if you go to Europe today, you probably say, "I'm an American," before you might say, "I'm a Californian." But back then, people really did identify with their states. And so there's great pride in their states. In the Federalist Papers, both Hamilton and Madison argue for the new Constitution, making that argument that people are always going to feel loyal and feel more pride in their state than they will in this new national government. And state wealth is another explanation, that the states had money and the states had the money comes from the states, goes to the national government, sometimes gets reallocated, but especially in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, the real repository of wealth tended to be at the state as opposed to the national level. Not to mention, states controlled elections. They had the power in the Constitution to conduct their own elections. And so there are a lot of good reasons why power is dispersed down to state governments and not just centralized at the national level. Another thing that he explores in the article is this idea of the role of political parties in federalism and the weakness, as he refers to it, of political parties and our system of government, and that our parties tend to be weaker than what we tend to see in our European counterparts. So he then asks the question, well, why are parties weaker? And the so what, so what's the big deal? If parties are weaker, what does that really mean for administrators? What does it mean for administrators when parties are weak and parties aren't giving the support to administrators that you usually see in other countries? So what? What does that mean for those administrators? How does that change the role of those administrators?
They get to continue with their role primarily being like continuity of government, and they don't have a bunch of policy being injected into the decisions that they're making. Right. And then I think he was also saying that I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, well, no, I think you're on the right train. Yeah, I think it's true that it fundamentally changes what they do as administrators, in that you don't have parties to kind of take the pressure off of the administrators. And so administrators in this continuity of government, in keeping government going, they oftentimes have to build their own basis of power. Norton Long, if you read a Norton Long in the program, Norton Long talks a lot about this in his writings, is that because political parties are weak, they don't give political support to administrators. So administrators have to go out there and they have to develop their own political support. When they go out there and develop their own political support, it means that they have to kind of become political actors. And so, as he says in the article, administrators play politics and politicians play administration. And there's kind of this, duality of roles that the two groups play. Going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson and the study of administration, which I know you read in the 500 class and probably revisit it several times throughout your time in the program. As Wilson said in the study of administration, even when he's creating this politics administration dichotomy, he acknowledged that politics are always the touchstone of administration. And administration always happens within this type of political environment. So administrators start playing politics. Administrators get sucked into the world of what's called casework. And so in order to get reelected, members of Congress have to respond to their constituents' needs. So if a constituent has a problem, they'll contact a member of Congress. Member of Congress will then fall all over themselves to try and solve this problem for the constituent. As the old adage is, you solve one problem for a constituent, you have a voter for life. And so they end up then pressuring administrators to do a lot of the casework, individual work with citizens to try and solve their problems. Again, kind of making them very connected to individual citizens, and kind of gives us a different role for administrators than we would normally think of. It also then provides what he calls a crack that citizens can use to contact administrators. So as a citizen, you don't just need to vote. That's not just one way in which you can participate. You can also send letters to your member of Congress, your member of the House, your member of the Senate. Send letters to your member of the state assembly or state senate, to your city council person, to your member of your school board. Or you can go to administrative agencies and go directly to the agencies that are administering these programs. And that's another crack that you can exploit in the system in order to participate and have your voice heard. This really gives birth to this idea of a multiple crack type of federalism. So Grodzins argues that our system is what he calls a multiple crack system, that there are multiple fissures, if you will, in the system. And people can utilize those multiple cracks to participate. When they're using all these multiple cracks to participate, power flows through those cracks. And so that multiple crack type of idea provides us with a lot of this disbursement and distribution of power throughout the entire system. When you've got these multiple cracks and you have all this power that's flowing between different levels of government, between citizens and elected officials and citizens and administrators, you basically end up with what they have referred to over time as marble cake federalism. Marble cake federalism is when you have this intertwining of the functions and responsibilities and powers between all the different levels of your federal system. It's like a marble cake. Everything is kind of mixed in with everything else, as opposed to a layer cake, which would be an example of coordinated authority model of federalism. So in a layer cake, you've got the national layer, state layer, local level. They're all separated by frosting. They're all different levels. That's a layer cake. That's what you would have with coordinated authority. Marble cake is what we end up with overlapping authority. So the big point to take away from the Grodzins article is this idea of multiple crack approach to federalism, and the fact that Grodzins argues we never really had coordinated authority model. We have always been an overlapping authority model of federalism. We have always had this intermingling and commingling of powers and functions between all of our levels of government. That's a very important point because, again, it kind of reverses a lot of the thought at the time in terms of how the different levels of government interacted in the 1700s and the 1800s. Now Grodzin's telling us it's not like that. They're actually always been intertwined with each other. When you take this and you apply it to how federalism has developed over the past 200 years, it again is a little different than the way in which federalism is oftentimes taught. Now, I don't want to leave Grodzin's proposition hanging out there unchallenged. And I do think it's important for us to recognize that there were people who stood up and said Grodzin's was wrong. Harry Scheiber is one. And Harry Scheiber, in a previous manifestation of the textbook, had a rejoinder or a response to the Grodzin article saying Grodzin's wrong. The methodology he uses to arrive at his conclusion that we've always been overlapping authority, we've always been a marble cake system of federalism, it was a flawed methodology. And so there was pushback to this idea that Grodzin's presented to the rest of the federalism authors in the literature. But when we look at federalism over the past 200 years, the basic assumption is that, number one, federalism is a dynamic system of government. The relationships between our different levels of government change over time. And it depends upon the era, depends upon the issue, depends upon the participants involved in terms of determining what type of era or what type of approach to federalism we had at any given point in time. The traditional approach to how federalism has developed over the past 200 years is what I'm sharing with you on the screen now, the different distinct eras of federalism. And again, this is kind of the traditionalist approach. Grodzins would disagree with this, but this is typically how federalism scholars tend to look at the development of American federalism. The first era of American federalism is typically seen as being what we call dual federalism. And that's from the inception of the country in the 1780s up to the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. Dual federalism is that layer cake approach to federalism. It is that coordinate authority type of model. The two spheres of influence between national and state governments are completely separate from each other. They do not overlap. They usually do not interact. National government has its duties and its sphere of influence. State governments have their sphere of influence. In dual federalism, the sphere of influence for the national government was small and the sphere of influence for state government was much bigger. So if you're drawing your Venn diagram, the circle for national government powers is small, the state government circle is much larger. So that's dual federalism up to the Civil War. After the Civil War, the idea of states' rights and this whole idea of Calhoun borrowing from Madison is kind of dead. So, again, John C. Calhoun and other advocates of states' rights borrow from Madison's argument and said, yes, states created the Constitution, therefore states can basically leave the Constitution and leave the Union. Obviously, once the Civil War is over, we know states can't leave the Constitution and states are not allowed to leave the Union. So it's no longer states created, states can destroy it. So once the Civil War ends, we move into Reconstruction, we shift from this idea of dual federalism into what we call competitive federalism. And competitive federalism essentially ran from the end of the Civil War up to the FDR administration and up to the beginnings of the New Deal. Now, in competitive federalism, we were still using the layer cake model. We were still using the coordinate authority model of federalism. The difference, though, is throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, the sphere of influence of the national government begins to grow, and the sphere of influence for state governments begins to contract. It's this whole idea of this zero-sum game type of an approach that was talked about, that Josh talked about. The type 1 game theory, where it's zero-sum game, that if the national government is going to increase its sphere of power, it's going to do so at the detriment of state governments. There's only a finite universe of power and authority out there. So if one party increases, it does so at the detriment of the other party. And you can see that throughout competitive federalism. The national government started getting involved in a lot more regulation of the economy, regulation of workplace safety, regulation of food safety, regulation of pharmaceutical drugs, all these additional regulatory efforts by the national government began to erode power from states. Because in the past, when it was done by states. Now we've got things such as the Interstate Commerce Commission, that's no longer around, but the Interstate Commerce Commission. And we got the creation of the FCC eventually. We end up the creation of the FTC and all these regulatory agencies, the SEC, all these regulatory agencies to regulate all these different activities and behaviors in the economy that used to be the domain of state governments. So competitive federalism really was the dominant approach to federalism up to the New Deal with FDR. So as you know, we had the Great Depression, stock market crash, Great Depression, FDR is elected, and FDR brings with him into office this New Deal approach, whereby the national government will create all these alphabet agencies and will create all these new programs to help pull state and local governments out of the doldrums of the Great Depression. So once those New Deal programs go into effect and are then sanctioned by the Supreme Court, and remember, a lot of those early New Deal programs that were established by FDR were not looked upon very favorably by the Supreme Court in terms of constitutionality. And the Supreme Court stood up and objected to some of those and declared some of those to be unconstitutional. And what did FDR do when they declared those laws to be unconstitutional? Anybody remember that from history? What FDR's strategy was?
I think he said that so now you guys have to make me do it, right? Like the bully pulpit, and he wanted pressure from the people to actually implement those things.
Yeah, I think there was some politicization, if you will, of the Supreme Court, and that yes, he wanted people to put pressure on the Supreme Court, and I think that really kind of started the whole era of a political approach to trying to influence Supreme Court decisions. And even at a more basic level, he said, I'm going to court pack. Well, you're not going to approve my New Deal program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the size of the court. And when I increase the size of the court, now I'm going to end up having, an additional 4 to 6 people that I can nominate to then go onto the court. And my nominees then will pack the court, and you'll then have no choice because you'll be outvoted by all of my nominees. So he made this court packing threat. The court packing threat was just that, it was a threat. He never went through with it. But lo and behold, and I'm not saying that this is a direct correlation, but you can decide. Lo and behold, after the court packing threat was made, a lot of these policies, a lot of these programs suddenly became constitutional in the eyes of the court. And I think it was a very effective strategy that he used to get the court to cede to the constitutionality of some of these New Deal programs. So once the Supreme Court was on board with sanctioning these programs as being constitutional, then you had this explosion of federal government programs and federal government agencies. But the relationship between these agencies and state and local governments was a relationship that was mostly determined by money. So we have the rise of all these grant programs. So you create this program at the national level, and then you put federal dollars behind it by funneling federal dollars down to state and local governments that will then incentivize and induce state and local governments to then meet the objectives of these programs. So in the cooperative era of federalism, a lot of people refer to that as fiscal federalism, where the relationship between the different levels of government really started to be determined by money, and money more than ideology. So in cooperative federalism, we really see this rise of fiscal federalism as well. So throughout the New Deal and all the way up to the Johnson administration, a lot of scholars will argue we were still in this cooperative federalism phase. Our model has now changed. So the model under dual federalism and competitive federalism was a coordinate authority model. Now, as you might guess, under cooperative federalism, it now becomes an overlapping authority model. So we have a big overlap between what federal and state and local governments are doing. And most of that overlap is being governed by federal grants in aid. Then we have Johnson. President Lyndon Johnson comes into office. And when Lyndon Johnson comes into office after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, he begins to bring with him his own approach to federalism. His approach to federalism really started to crystallize in about 1965, and it was an approach that's come to be known as creative federalism. Johnson believed in decision-making in Washington, D.C. He believed in centralized decision-making, that it should be the national government making a lot of these decisions as opposed to leaving these decisions for state and local governments. So in his era of creative federalism, he would establish a program at the national level, and then he would get state and local governments to achieve national objectives, again, sometimes with very specific grants like categorical grants, or through the use of mandates, where he would order them to do it subject to civil or criminal penalty. So through the use of very specific categorical grants and mandate programs, he was able to force state and local governments to achieve objectives established at the national level. Well, here we change models again. So here we go from the overlapping authority model into what Josh told us about, the inclusive authority model. So in creative federalism, we now have this inclusive authority model where the local and state spheres of influence are subsumed within the larger federal sphere of influence. So again, what state and local governments are doing is subject to federal authority. It's called creative federalism because in order, again, to get state and local governments to do his bidding, Johnson used these creative tools like categorical grants and different types of mandates that we are going to talk about later on when we get into the administrative aspects of federalism in a future week. But this area of creative federalism wasn't very long-lived because, as we know, President Johnson decided not to run for re-election in 1968 due to the Vietnam War and troubles with his popularity ratings. He decided to go back to Texas, did not run for re-election. We ended up electing Richard Nixon as president. So when Nixon comes into the White House in 1969, he brings with him his approach known as New Federalism. Not a terribly creative name, but New Federalism. And his New Federalism approach was diametrically opposed to Johnson's Creative Federalism. So instead of a top-down centralized approach to decision-making, New Federalism really placed the premium on a bottom-up decentralization approach. And Nixon's New Federalism was predicated on what he called the 3 Ds of federalism. And the 3 Ds of federalism are 3 words that all start with D. The first D is centralization. So we would decentralize decision-making, and we would allow state and local governments to participate in the decision-making process. This goes back to last week, that one concept we talked about, the correspondence principle. Well, here we are with the correspondence principle. Nixon argued that local governments were at the heart of a lot of these programs. They were most directly impacted by the programs, so therefore they should be able to participate in decision-making regarding those programs. So let's decentralize decision-making, give state and local governments a seat at the decision-making table. Because after all, who knows what's in the best interest of local citizens than local governments, the governments that are closest to those citizens. The second D of New Federalism is what he called devolution. Devolution spoke to power and resources. So in decentralization, if you are going to give state and local governments a seat at the decision-making table, and you're going to allow them to make decisions, then in devolution, you are going to give them the resources and the power to carry out those decisions. So this gets to a term we talked about last week as well, subsidiarity, providing the resources for state and local governments to carry out their decisions. That's devolution, and that was the second D. And then you can probably guess the third D is deregulation. Let's remove some of what Nixon saw as these overly oppressive regulations on businesses as well as on state and local governments, and free them up to compete with each other to then provide higher quality services at a lower cost. So we do this decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. That was his new approach to federalism, to kind of turn back authority to state and local governments. The primary vehicle that Nixon used to accomplish this was something called general revenue sharing. In general revenue sharing, the federal government would turn over a percentage of federal income tax revenue to state and local governments to use as they see fit. Very few strings attached, very few accountability mechanisms. You can see how a general revenue sharing approach would fit really well with New Federalism. The problem, obviously, is we didn't have a whole lot of revenue out there to share, but at least conceptually, it supported this idea of decentralization and devolution. Then in 1981, President Reagan comes into the White House after one term of Jimmy Carter. And when Reagan comes into the White House, he was a big adherent to New Federalism. He believed in New Federalism. He believed in this decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. So he ushered in a new period of New Federalism. Hence the reason why a lot of scholars call it New Federalism. The basic philosophical premise was the same as Nixon's New Federalism, but the tools that Reagan used were a little bit different than the tools used by Nixon. One of the primary tools that Reagan used in his devolution and decentralization approach was the use of these things called block grants. So block grants that had been developed back in the 1930s and 40s, he started using block grants in order to provide money with fewer strings attached than what state and local governments saw under creative federalism. So he took a lot of those categorical grants, very specific grant programs that were used by Johnson in creative federalism, and he replaced those categorical grants with these much broader types of block grants. Block grants then allowed state and local governments to use the money however they saw fit, as long as the use of that money accomplished programmatic goals. So you can use your money for educating at-risk youth, on a variety of different programs. You can use it for midnight basketball or job training or counseling or childcare, as long as the use of that money helps you educate at-risk youth and get them prepared for the workforce. So that was Reagan's new federalism. Runs through the Reagan administration, runs through George H.W. Bush administration up to 1992. Once we had the advent of the Clinton-Gore administration and subsequent administrations, I like to say that the era of federalism we're currently in is what I call contextual federalism. In that, as I presented before the break, federalism and contextual federalism is not so much defined by ideology as it is by issue. So it depends upon the issue. And you all know me, I love the answer, it depends. Well, it depends upon the issue. So for some issues, we are going to maybe advocate for a centralized approach. For other issues, we're going to advocate for a decentralized approach and for local governments to have the power and the authority over those types of decisions. You can see that across all these different administrations. I may have mentioned it before, but when you look at administrations like the Clinton administration, on some issues, Clinton administration really did favor a top-down centralized type of approach. On other issues, they favored a more decentralized new federalism type of approach. In the George W. Bush administration, same type of thing. On most issues, it was decentralization, but on issues such as education standards and No Child Left Behind, it became much more of a top-down, where the national government establishes these goals, and then it's up to local districts and state governments to meet those goals. And one of the goals was a 100% proficiency rate. We know statistically 100% is impossible to achieve, but that was one of the goals under No Child Left Behind. So that's a very centralizing approach, whereby most other issues, it was very decentralizing. Obama administration, you have a similar type of situation where Obama's approach to federalism is oftentimes referred to by scholars as nuanced federalism, where President Obama was very much inclined to take a nuanced approach to how he enforced federal laws and regulations on state and local governments. So a great example of that is marijuana. And I don't want to get too much into it because there is an article on marijuana later on in the class. But we know that states have begun, and many states have done this a few years ago, they've begun legalizing not just medical marijuana, but also the use of recreational marijuana. Well, as states are doing that, marijuana still exists as a scheduled drug on the federal drug schedule. And so there are still federal laws against the use of marijuana, even though there are no state laws against the use of marijuana in certain states like California and Colorado and Oregon and other states. The Obama administration chose not to enforce federal law because they didn't want to come into a disagreement with state governments over the use of marijuana. So again, it's kind of a nuanced approach. The federal laws are on the books, but they chose not to implement those types of federal laws. In the Trump administration, again, a lot of it's issue-based, a lot of decentralization, but on some issues, again, a much more centralized approach where, especially in terms of election law. And election law, you want a centralized approach to election law as opposed to allowing states to kind of do their own thing because, again, the rhetoric of the elections are rigged and stop the steal and all that stuff. And so you kind of have these differing centralization versus decentralization depending upon the issue. Again, the Biden administration, it's a little young in the Biden administration to make any conclusions, but I would not be surprised to see contextual federalism also carry the day in the Biden administration as well. So for the most part, when we look at the development of federalism, this is kind of the way in which we look at that development, in that the relationship between federal, state, and local governments, those relationships are certainly not carved in stone. Those relationships are more a sign of the time, those involved in the issue that we are dealing with when we're talking about those types of relationships. The upshot of this and the implication of this is that federalism today is more difficult to study than it was in the previous eras of federalism. In the previous eras of federalism, we could hang our hats on ideology. And so we knew someone's ideology, we could pretty much guess what their approach to federalism would be. Today, ideology doesn't really give us as good of a guide as the issue itself. And so it's very much issue dependent, which makes it a much more complicated and complex endeavor to study American federalism today than it ever has been in the past. But again, Grodzins would tell us that there never really was dual federalism. Most federalism scholars will say, yes, there was dual federalism and there was a coordinate authority approach earlier on in the late 1700s and throughout most of the 1800s. Then our final article, and again, I don't want to keep you here too long tonight, but our final article is an article by Martha Durthick. And I always have to say Martha Durthick a little slowly because we used to have a faculty member on faculty here at Long Beach named Martha Deedy. And so I always want to say Martha Deedy instead of Martha Durthick. But Martha Durthick in her article, The Paradox of the Middle Tier. In The Paradox of the Middle Tier, we see Durthick sounding a lot of the same themes that we have seen in earlier articles that we have read for this evening. Things such as the primacy of state governments and why state governments may have a preferential place in American federalism, but why are they not exercising that preferential place? So she starts off with this whole idea, it's in the title of her article, The Paradox of the Middle Tier. What does she mean by the middle tier? I think we all know that. It's pretty obvious. She's talking about state governments. She's talking about three levels of government: national, state, and local. And state governments occupy this position in the middle tier of our system of federalism. When state governments are occupying this middle tier, there is a paradox. What is her paradox of the middle tier? What does she mean by the paradox of the middle tier? What is her paradox?
Well, is it that the state is sort of beholden in two directions to both local and federal?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like basically they're the middleman in a lot of cases.
Right? Yeah, they're in this middle tier, and so they have pressures coming from above, they have pressures coming from below, and it does. And she doesn't talk a lot about this. This is more me, but it does lead to some hypocrisy on the part of state governments, in that state governments will complain vehemently about partially and unfunded mandates from the federal government. So the national government tells the state government to do something and then does not provide ample resources or required resources to carry out that duty. Then state governments will complain to the heavens about how this is unfair and this is a violation of subsidiarity, it's a violation of federalism. But then state governments turn around and impose unfunded and partially funded mandates on their local governments and then turn a deaf ear oftentimes to those same types of criticisms coming from local governments. And I think it is kind of that awkward position, being in this middle tier where you're not necessarily at the dominant level, you're not necessarily at the submissive level of a local government, you're kind of in this netherworld here in this middle tier. The paradox for her is that these states that are operating at this middle tier, they were the first state. They were the first governments. And so they predate the national government. So you would think if they have this primacy as their primary resource, that they would be able to fend off incursions upon their power by the national government. They were the first governments. They were around before the Constitution and before the nation was founded. So why do they find it so difficult to fight off these incursions from the national government? And she goes through, and we won't go through it for the sake of time, but she goes through a lot of examples of how the national government continued to expand its power and authority over state governments. We talked about that already when we talked about the era of competitive federalism and the advent of all of these federal regulations throughout the economy and federal regulations of state governments. That was kind of this incursion of national government power upon the authority of state governments. So you got this kind of march toward national authority. And she's wondering, why can't states push back on that? Why can't states organize and oppose those types of federal actions? Why? Why is it so hard for states to organize and oppose federal incursion of authority?
Funding, money.
Yeah, sure, funding. A lot of these incursions of authority come with dollar signs attached to them.
Mhm.
And so you got this federal money coming in. This is federal money that is not coming from your own source, your own tax revenue. And so I hate to call it free money, but it kind of feels like free money because you're not going to be held politically accountable for increasing taxes to get this money. And so it's kind of hard to walk away from that free money and say, no, no, on philosophical federalism principles, we are going to reject that money. Now, we did see some Republican governors do that recently. A Republican governor saying, no, we are not going to do this. We're not going to accept this federal money because we don't agree with the program. We saw that with Medicaid expansion as an example, where they said, we're not going to do this expansion. We're going to turn back this federal money. We're not going to accept it. We saw that to a degree with the Affordable Care Act and the creation of these exchanges, where some states walked away and said, we're not going to engage in this. We're not going to create an exchange. They left it to the federal government to do. And they ended up getting exchanges that were created by the federal government that they weren't very fond of. But it's because philosophically, they were trying to walk away from that money for those philosophical reasons. But it's difficult to walk away from federal dollars. So you're right, funding has a lot to do with it. Why else? Any other reasons why it's difficult to organize and oppose those types of federal actions?
Public
Because
pressure.
they're,
I'm sorry, I had two. So
Go ahead, Bert. Go ahead, Paul.
because they may be acting in their own self-interest. And
Right.
if they're acting in their own self-interest, that might conflict with, the goal of another state.
absolutely, yeah. We think of states oftentimes, just like any other actor, will oftentimes operate in their own rational self-interest. So the rational self-interest of Colorado may run completely counter to the rational self-interest of Massachusetts. And so when they're both pursuing their self-interest and those self-interests are opposed to each other, it's going to be difficult for Colorado and Massachusetts to get together and cooperate to fight against these federal intrusions. Think about it in terms of economic growth and in terms of states advertising for businesses to move to their states. That's a very antagonistic type of relationship. We see it all the time. We see the billboards of, I'm talking about my home state of Ohio, where Ohio will say, move out of California, come to Ohio. We'll give you these tax abatements, and we'll have this ample labor pool that will demand lower wages, and you can be able to avoid all these taxes and all these regulations. They'll be much cheaper to do business in the state of Ohio. And so you've got that kind of antagonistic relationship. Anything else?
I was going to say public pressure, right?
Sure.
And interest groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of public pressure, a lot of political pressure.
Mhm.
And a lot of that pressure, you're absolutely right, a lot of that pressure comes because a lot of these federal programs are very attractive programs. They're very politically popular, and it's hard for a state to stand up and tell their residents, no, we're not gonna participate in this very popular program that you all want to participate in. We're not going to do it for the sake of federalism. We're not going to do it for the sake of state sovereignty. So absolutely, these very politically popular programs, and Congress has gotten very adept at designing these types of programs to be politically popular and make it difficult for states to get together.
Yep.
Excellent. Absolutely. And so you've got a lot of these reasons that states find it hard to really join forces and push back on the federal government. And because of that, the federal government has continued to have these intrusions upon state authority. These intrusions upon state authority, according to Derthick, creates a series of mismatches. And Derthick identifies three main mismatches. I'm going to put on my old guy glasses so I can read them to you. But she talks about in page 71, the mismatches in modern federalism. At least three undesirable consequences are evidence. I will call them mismatches. Mismatches between prescription and practicality, between the locus of responsibility for generating public benefits and for paying costs, and between the locus of responsibility for defining public goals and for making trade-offs among them. Essentially, what she's saying is that the mismatch is that the national government will offer up these prescriptions. They will offer up, here is what we should be doing, here is what you should be doing, without a lot of an eye on practicality. And so the national government and Congress won't have to worry much about whether or not these solutions are practical for implementation, because they're not the ones who have to implement. And so you get these grand prescriptions coming from the national government, and then it's left up to state and local governments to actually implement them. And there's a mismatch because those grand prescriptions are sometimes impossible, or at least very, very difficult for state and local governments to implement. When you think about the roles and responsibilities of federal government versus state governments, most of the things that the federal government does are what we call indirect in nature. They're indirect administration. They put forth the national objectives, and then they provide some resources to carry out those national objectives. But they're not the ones who are actually doing the street level bureaucrat type of business, as Michael Lipsky would say. They're not the ones who are interfacing with citizens and dealing with the practical elements of implementation. That's left to the local government. And so the local government has to try and figure all that out. So it's a mismatch between prescriptions and the practicality, essentially, of implementing those prescriptions. It's a mismatch between the locus of responsibility for generating public benefits and for paying the cost. Congress likes to claim credit for things, but there is a real cost to local governments in implementing these types of programs. And Congress doesn't really care all that much sometimes about the paying for their costs. They like the generation of benefits. They don't really care all that much about paying the cost to generate those benefits. And a mismatch between the locus of responsibility for defining public goals and for making trade-offs among them. So it's very easy at the national level to identify, here is the goal that we are trying to accomplish, without really understanding the trade-offs and the bargaining and the negotiation that goes into actually trying to achieve those goals, because Congress doesn't necessarily engage in that day-to-day implementation, bargaining, and negotiation. In a future class, when we talk about the administrative aspects of federalism, we'll read an article by Agronoff. And the article by Agronoff will look at bargaining and negotiation, and how a lot of what we do in federalism is not necessarily prescribed in law, but rather it's the informal negotiation and bargaining that goes on between local governments, between local and state governments. And we don't really take that into account when we have the federal government making these decisions and handing these decisions off to locals. So we really don't take, the mismatches are, we're really not taking into account the realities of implementing these programs and policies on the ground at the local government level, when the federal government takes control of these programs and the federal government has these incursions onto what used to be state and local power and state and local authority. So, and it is frustrating for a lot. Now, states have tried to join together to fight back and push back on federal intrusion. Next week, we'll talk about the Camisa article. And the Camisa article talks about some of the ways in which states have fought back in creating, these public interest groups, and things like the National Governors Association, the National League of Cities, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National Conference of State Budget Officers, and use those as vehicles to try and kind of work together and push back. We'll talk about the Ann Bowman article, where she'll introduce us to some of these specific things that have been done, like the forming of compacts and multi-state legal action, where states have gotten together and tried to push back. But it's inherently difficult to do, because really the deck is stacked against local governments being able to work together, primarily because of their self-interest, primarily because of not wanting to lose the funding, and primarily because a lot of these national objectives are very, very politically popular programs that's difficult to stand up and object to on philosophical bases. So it's kind of depressing, I think, when you read the Derthik article, that it kind of leaves states in this lurch, in this middle tier, this kind of netherworld between the top level and the bottom level, and they struggle to try and push back against the federal government taking away their power and their authority. Again, I didn't do a lot of discussion of that article because I didn't want to keep you here too long tonight. But I think when you take all these articles together, I think what they do is they give us a pretty good basis for understanding why we have the intergovernmental system that we currently have today. We know what's in the Constitution. Thanks to the Federalist Papers, we know what the framers thought about these different levels of government and why they established the compromises that they established in the Constitution. We know, courtesy of Deal Right, that we've got these three main models that we can hang our hat on. When we look at the relationship between the different levels of government, we can link those relationships up depending upon which model they are emphasizing. Thanks to Morton Grodzins, we know that the administrators really have to deal with these multiple cracks, and that it's not this layer cake type of approach we've always thought of. It's really more of this marble cake, whereby there are multiple cracks in the system, whereby people can participate and power can flow up and down through the federal system. So it's not as clear cut of a relationship between governments as we originally thought it would be. And state governments, thanks to Martha Durthick, we know are in a precarious position in that even though they were the first governments, there are some real tangible reasons why it's difficult for them to get together and work against increases in federal government power and intrusions upon state and local autonomy. So we've got this situation where we've got these three levels of government, and the relationships really will depend upon the period of time that we are talking about, the people who were involved in those discussions, as well as the issue that we are dealing with. Next week, when we get into our discussion of the political aspects of federalism, we are really going to start to focus on some of those political vehicles that state and local governments use, as well as the federal government will use, to try and influence these relationships between the three levels of government. We'll really look at how politically we can change these relationships and influence these relationships. Then the following week, we'll get into the financial vehicles, and the fiscal tools that we can use to adjust and change these relationships between the three levels of government. And the week after that, we'll get into the administrative vehicles like mandates and things such as that we can use to, again, adjust this relationship between our different levels. So as you can see, we've kind of laid this out: political, fiscal, and then administrative. So next week, when we do our political articles, on October 6th, we have 4 articles that evening. So we have the Commissa article, Governments as Interest Groups, and that one belongs to Lewis. We have the Trend and Issues in Interstate Cooperation by Ann Ohm Bowman. That one belongs to Kathy. We have the Ways of Achieving Federal Objectives by, again, Martha Durthick, a second Durthick article. That one belongs to Adam. And then the 4th and final article next week will be the Beyond Preemption article by DeWitt, and that one belongs to Evelyn. So those are kind of our political articles, the ones that we will cover next week. Again, if you want to do article critique on any of those 4 articles, do make sure that you get those article critiques submitted before 6 o'clock next Wednesday. Okay. All right. That's all I have for this evening. Are there any questions or observations or comments on any of the articles that we discussed tonight, and kind of this wrap up of the background and foundations of American federalism? Okay. Everyone good? All right. Seeing everyone is good, we will call the night. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And I look forward to talking to you again next Wednesday when we talk about the political aspects of American federalism. So thanks, everyone.
Hi, guys.
Great evening.
Night.